for coming tonight. My name is Miriam Ibrahim. I'm a member of Palestine Solidarity Network here in Edmonton. That's one of the groups that was involved in organizing tonight's event. And I'd also like to thank members of the People's Poets and all the other community members who helped to organize tonight's event. Tonight we'll be hearing from Yves Engler on his latest book. Yves is a Montreal writer and activist and a former vice president of the Concordia Students' Union. He has authored 2 other books, Playing Left Wing, From Rink Rat to Student Radical, and with Anthony Fenton, Canada and Haiti, Waging War on the Poor Majority. Those, along with his latest book, I think are available at the back of the room, so feel free to take a look after the talk. Praised by the likes of Noam Chomsky and William Blum, his most recent book, The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, could very well change the way you see Canada, and counters the mythology of Canada as a force for good in the world, by exposing this country's policies, both past and present, in places such as Afghanistan, Haiti, and Sudan, among others. So please join me in welcoming Yves Engler.
Thanks for that. And thanks to the organizers for organizing this, and thanks everyone for coming out. I know it's been a hard spring and winter here, and it's very nice out, so I can imagine people had other things outside that they may have liked to do. So this is a book tour for the Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, and what I have here is a PowerPoint that sort of I wouldn't say it provides a summary, but provides some information that's in the book that I think people will find interesting and sort of I think help people better understand the real history of Canadian foreign policy. And this book, it comes out, for me on a personal level, it comes out of my role in the Canada-Haiti Solidarity Movement, Canada-Haiti Action Network, in participating in the solidarity movement against Canada's role in overthrowing Haiti's elected government in February 2004. The Canadian government, Canadian troops secured the airport from which Haiti's elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, says he was kidnapped by US Marines. Canada participated militarily in the invasion of Haiti, supported this brutal dictatorship, 25-month dictatorship that was responsible for thousands of people being killed. Canadian police, Canada financed, trained, diplomatically justified the Haitian National Police, who, after the coup, went into the poor neighborhoods, violently repressed neighborhoods that were the slums where support for Aristide was strong, regularly fired on unarmed demonstrators demanding the return of Haiti's elected president. And really all arms of the Canadian state participated in this imperial crime against the Haitian people. And going into the Haiti Solidarity Movement, I had a certain sense of the dispossession towards First Nations people in this country. I had a certain sense of the class dynamic of our society, but I didn't believe that Ottawa would act or acts in a similar way as Washington on the international sphere. And participating in the Haiti Solidarity Movement, these illusions about Canadian foreign policy, I was very much disabused of this sort of mythology that we, I think, grow up with, that says that Canada is a force for good on the international scene, a peacekeeper, a sort of benevolent force working to fight against injustice around the world. So part of this book for me was at the end of the Haiti Solidarity Movement. I basically asked myself, or sort of the end of the Haiti Solidarity Movement, but the end of the worst repression in Haiti, I decided to look at whether Canada has acted or is acting in a similar way to the way it's been acting in Haiti elsewhere. The second motivation for writing the book was to take on this mythology that we have of Canada as a benevolent force in the world. Canadian self-appraisal of their country's role in the world is the highest of any country. 9 in 10 Canadians think that Canada is a force for good in the world. And I found that this was a real obstacle to the Haiti solidarity activism that I was participating in, because we'd go to Canadians, we'd say, the Canadian International Development Agency is financing a highly partisan Haitian human rights organization, which has concocted a whole set of lies to justify imprisoning Haiti's constitutional prime minister, constitutional interior minister, and that our aid agency is consciously funding this process with so-called aid dollars. We would tell Canadians this was taking place, which it was, and many people had a hard time believing that their government would act in such a dubious or pernicious way abroad. So I was ready to take on, one of the motivations for writing this book is to take on that mythology. So what I got here is a list of things that we probably don't know about Canadian foreign policy that I think we should help us better understand the real history of Canadian foreign policy. In 1917, the Royal Bank loaned $200,000 to a Costa Rican dictator, Federico Tinoco. Just as he was about to flee, there was an uprising in the country, and days before he was about to flee, Royal Bank provided $200,000. Tinoco, of course, took that money when he left. The new government said, this is an odious debt. We're not paying this debt which Tinoco has taken the money. We're not paying this back from public coffers. Royal Bank and the new government negotiated this debt for a few years, and Ottawa stepped in to support the Royal Bank by sending the Patriot, Patrician, and Aurora, 3 Canadian gunboats, to help the Royal Bank satisfactorily negotiate its outstanding claim with the Costa Rican government in 1921. So you go all the way back to 1921, you have an example of Canadian gunboat diplomacy, sending naval vessels to exert political pressure on a country at the behest of Canadian corporate interests. In January 1932, front page Vancouver Sun read, El Salvador alive with red revolt. The subheadline explained, Canadian destroyers from British Columbia to the rescue. There was an indigenous peasant uprising in El Salvador. British interests, as well as some Canadian, but particularly British railway and banking interests, were threatened. The Hernandez-Martinez government in El Salvador was sort of waffling on sending out the troops to put down the rebellion. London asked Ottawa to send 2 naval vessels that Canada had in the region. 2 Canadian naval vessels went off the coast of El Salvador. According to the Canadian commander, Brodeur was his name, it was the presence of the Canadian troops who landed in El Salvador that provided Martinez with the backbone to send out the military and repress the uprising. In El Salvador, in history, it's called La Matanza. As many as 30,000 people were killed, including Farabundo Martí, who's the namesake of the FMLN, the political party that just won elections in El Salvador about 3 months ago. So you have an example of Canadian gunboat diplomacy all the way back in 1932 at the behest of British imperial interests. The anti-war movement in this country won a significant victory by forcing the Chrétien government to not publicly join the Bush administration's coalition of the willing. Definitely a victory, but the Chrétien government's response to the public protest was to publicly move away from the US invasion of Iraq, but privately or behind our backs do all it could to support the US invasion and occupation. US troops flew over Canadian airspace, refueling in Newfoundland. Some countries won coalition of the willing status simply for providing the US with the ability to fly over their airspace. Canada was in charge of Task Force 151, the NATO naval brigade that patrolled off the coast of Iraq in the Arabian Sea in the lead up to the war. And the Chrétien government actually had legal opinion that because of Canada's role in Task Force 151, that Canada was legally at war with Iraq. A number, as many as 10 Canadian naval vessels participated in different missions off the coast of Iraq in the 8 months before the invasion and 7 months after the invasion. At least 30 Canadian troops incorporated in British and US units fought in Iraq. Other countries that were not part of the coalition, the willing, that had troops on exchange programs with British or US units involved in Iraq, they withdrew their troops. Canada did not. Canadian military planners helped plan the war, initially from Tampa, Florida. And when the Americans moved their main planning base from Tampa to Qatar, at least 25 Canadian military planners made that move. Canada's current head of the Army, General Walt Natadzinc, was Deputy Forces Commander in Baghdad, in charge of 35,000 troops for a number of months. And there were at least 2 other Canadian generals in a similar position in the occupation. Canada's Joint Task Force 2 Special Commandos participated in the invasion, or not in the invasion, participated in the occupation and are known to be fighting in Iraq. And the Liberal government, once the Bush administration began to consolidate the occupation, or to try to consolidate the occupation at least, the Liberal government announced $300 million in Canadian aid to Iraq. And that's, I think, indicative of something I call the intervention equals aid principle. Or more crudely, where the US kills, Canada provides aid. And that principle goes all the way back to at least the Korean War of 1950 to 1953, where Canada provided significant aid to South Korea. Likewise, during the US war in Vietnam, Canada provided significant aid to South Vietnam. And today, the 3 major recipients of Canadian aid are Afghanistan #1, Haiti #2, and over the past number of years, Iraq. And what connects those 3 countries is not that they're in similar situations of poverty, but rather that to varying degrees, US and Canadian troops are occupying or repressing local populations. So part of this mythology of Canada as a benevolent force in the world comes out of the fact that this country, outside of what is current day Canada, never had colonies. So if we don't take the term First Nation seriously, which we should of course, but if we don't take that term seriously, this country never had external colonies. Unlike most Western European countries, Japan, and the US in a slightly different form. But that wasn't for a lack of trying among the Canadian foreign policy establishment. Actually, at one point, Robert Borden wanted to build a Canadian empire in Central America, Prime Minister Robert Borden in the 1910s. But there was a real concerted effort by the Ottawa elite, led by Canadian banking and insurance interests, which have been dominant force in the English Caribbean for the last 100 years. In the late 1800s, Canadian banking pushed for Ottawa to take control of the British colonies in the Caribbean. And after the First World War, when other dominions of the British Empire that fought on behalf of the Empire during the First World War, Australia, South Africa, they were compensated with German colonies nearby. After the war, they were compensated for participating in the war. Ottawa, Canada with no German colonies nearby, formally asked London if we could take over the British Caribbean as compensation for participating in the First World War. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is our good friend Pierre Trudeau, next to his good friend Augusto Pinochet. And the rest of this quote reads, this is the Canadian ambassador to Chile, quote, "The country has been on a prolonged political binge under the elected Allende government, and the junta has assumed the probably thankless task of sobering Chile up. In that sobering up process, more than 3,000 Chileans, supporters of the ousted elected Allende government, were killed. When the Canadian ambassador sent this cable from Santiago to Ottawa, there were thousands of Chileans, supporters of the Allende government, being illegally incarcerated, being tortured, and in many cases being killed at the infamous soccer stadium in Santiago. And I think, to actually maybe back up a little bit, we have sort of this positive perception where many people, particularly the Chilean community in Montreal, Vancouver, I think to a lesser degree, there were many Chileans that received asylum in Canada who were being persecuted by the Pinochet dictatorship, and had the Canadian government opened its doors to Chilean dissidents or Chilean supporters of the Allende government. So a lot of people have now sort of perceived that Canada was in some way sympathetic to the left in Chile during the coup period. But in fact, the Canadian government opening its door to Chileans being persecuted by Pinochet was a victory that the social movements, the protest solidarity groups in this country won. And it was a bone that the Trudeau government threw to the protest movements, because the Trudeau government didn't want to do what, above all else, the protest movements were calling for, which was Canada not supporting the destabilization of the Allende government, and particularly not supporting the Pinochet dictatorship. So going back all the way to 1964, when Eduardo Frei won presidential elections in Chile, Allende did quite well in those elections. Allende, an openly Marxist politician. Washington was nervous, as well as Ottawa, by how well Allende did, and Canada began its first ever aid program to a South American country, to the Frei government, to support the Frei government as a way to blunt the rise of Allende. That was ultimately unsuccessful. Allende won elections in 1970. Immediately, the Canadian government cut off aid to the elected Allende government. Export Development Canada cut off export development credits to the elected Allende government, restarted those credits on October 2nd, 1973, 3 weeks after the coup. Likewise, Ottawa supported Washington's move to cut off International Monetary Fund money to the elected Allende government. Immediately after the coup, Canada restarted or supported restarting IMF money to the Pinochet dictatorship. And within 5 years of the coup in Chile, Canadian corporations had more than $1 billion invested in Pinochet's Chile. So we think that Canadian aid is about helping the world's poor, when often it's used to advance narrow Canadian corporate interests. Billions of dollars of Canadian aid have gone to supporting International Monetary Fund structural adjustment programs. A major aim of IMF structural adjustment programs. Structural adjustment program is basically a way of the IMF pushing countries to open up to liberalize their economies, to pave the way or improve the situation for foreign investors. IMF structural adjustment programs, particularly in Africa, have gone a long way in terms of opening countries' resource sectors to foreign exploitation. Canadian companies, with 60% of the world's mining corporations based in Canada. Of course, Canadian capital has been the main beneficiary of this process. So in 1989, Canadian mining companies had about $250 million invested in Africa. By 2007, that had reached nearly $15 billion. And that's all the numerous African countries had their mining sectors opened up to foreign investment by IMF structural adjustment programs in the 80s and 90s. So Canada has been a major beneficiary of this process. And just a little comment on our media, how many times have we heard about how Africa is buying up, how many times have we heard about how China is buying up Africa? Yet how many times have we heard about the Canadian government, our institutions, our corporations buying up Africa? And there's certainly on a per capita basis, Canada has much more invested in Africa than China does. But specifically, the Canadian International Development Agency money, our aid dollars, tens of millions of our aid dollars, have gone specifically to rewriting countries' mining sectors, mining codes, mining regulations in the interests of foreign investors. The example that's received the most attention is in Colombia. Beginning in 1997, CETA began an $11 million project headed by an industry think tank in Calgary, where they asked American and Canadian mining companies what they would like to see in a new Colombian mining code. And this code was ultimately adopted in 2001. What it did was, among other things, reduce the royalty rates that mining companies paid from 5% on exports of less than 3 million tons and 10% on exports of more than 3 million tons down to 0.4%. Mining companies' concessions were increased from 25 years to 30 years. And according to the head of the Colombian Mine Workers Union, quote, "The new code flexibilized environmental regulations, diminished labor guarantees for workers, and opened the property of Afro-Colombian and indigenous people to exploitation." So, one of the important parts about mythology of Canada as a benevolent, sort of pacifistic force in the world is the fact that this country has the capacity to build, relatively easily at least, the capacity to build nuclear weapons, but has chosen not to. But there's actually more to it, and Canada has a bit of a history with nuclear weapons. So in the 50s, late 50s and early 60s, the CF-104 Starfighter, Canadian fighter jet based in Germany, had no gun. All it held was a thermonuclear weapon. Since at least 1950, U.S. Nukes have been stationed in Canada, particularly on U.S. fighter jets. Canada produces about 30% of the world's uranium. Canadian uranium was a big part of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And since the late 1940s, when the UN put forward a resolution calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons, Canada voted against that resolution, and since that time has voted against every single, or abstained on every single UN resolution calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons. One of the main examples cited of Ottawa standing up to bullying Americans is Cuba. After the Cuban Revolution, every country in the hemisphere, except for Mexico and Canada, severed relations with post-revolution Cuba. That's cited as an example of Ottawa standing up to U.S. Bullying, but there is more to the story. The book 3 Nights in Havana explains, quote, "Recently declassified State Department documents have revealed that, far from encouraging Canada to support the embargo," that's the U.S. embargo of Cuba, "the United States secretly urged Prime Minister Diefenbaker to maintain normal relations because it was thought that Canada would be well positioned to gather intelligence on the island." And that's precisely what Ottawa has done. Spied on Cuba for the last 4 or 5 decades for the Americans. According to a number of books on the intelligence world, Canada provides, quote, "the best military intelligence to the Americans on Cuba." And it's done mostly through the Communications Security Establishment. Based in Canadian embassies around the world, the Communications Security Establishment spies on foreign governments for Ottawa. How many people here have heard of the Communications Security Establishment? We have one person. That's about Norm at these talks. According to an Ottawa Citizen article a couple weeks ago, the CSE has more than 1,700 employees just based in Ottawa, not counting the employees all around the world. So there's an arm of the Canadian government that has a major function to spy on foreign governments that has more than 1,700 employees. And the vast majority of informed Canadians have no clue this agency even exists. I think that's quite a comment on the sort of democratic debate within this country about foreign policy. So, the older people in the audience, this is probably not that surprising. People who were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle know that that struggle was largely being waged against Canadian institutions that were supporting apartheid South Africa. For younger people, the apartheid regime, the racist regime in South Africa has been so demonized in our media that it seems odd that the Canadian government would have supported, Canadian corporations would have supported apartheid South Africa. But that is what happened. First of all, as a model. So South African officials regularly came to Canada to visit reserves, First Nations reserves, as they had done earlier with residential schools, to learn a model to bring back to control black South Africans. But the idea or the myth that Canada opposed apartheid South Africa really comes out of the fact that the Diefenbaker government supported the expulsion of the apartheid regime from the British Empire's Commonwealth in 1961. But Diefenbaker did not support expelling apartheid South Africa from the Commonwealth because of principled opposition to the racist regime, but rather because a number of Asian and African countries were threatening to pull out of the Commonwealth if South Africa was allowed to stay. So Diefenbaker was actually trying to defend the British Empire's Commonwealth, not take a principled stand against apartheid. And that's borne out, the reason for Diefenbaker's position is borne out by the fact that Canada had a preferential trade agreement with apartheid South Africa from 1932 until 1979. Canadian weapons made their way, including from Crown corporations, made their way to apartheid South Africa into the late 1970s, 1978. Canadian police trainers helped train the South African police until the early 1970s. And in October of 1982, the Trudeau government provided 4.91% of an IMF vote in favor of $1 billion credit to the apartheid regime. $1 billion credit that was opposed by 68 members of the IMF, by 121 members of the UN General Assembly. And that Canadian support was crucial because the vote only passed by 51.9%. And even during the sanctions period, and we should remember that the sanctions that Canada brought in against apartheid South Africa were based upon the fact that people in this country were mobilizing, were protesting Canada's support for apartheid. And even during the sanctions period, the Mulroney government still allowed a certain amount of trade, and Canadian trade was $1.6 billion from October 1993, 44% of the previous period. It's a little bit hot in here, eh? Are people familiar with Lumumba? Some people? If you're not, there's a documentary called Lumumba. It's a very good overview of what is probably, or who is probably considered Africa's preeminent independence leader. So, in 1960, the Congo won its independence from the Belgians. The Belgians' plan was basically to provide political independence, but maintain control over the country's military, maintain control over the country's vast mineral resources. Lumumba had a different conception, wanted a more genuine decolonization process, demanded Congolese control, most importantly over the minerals in the east of the country. The Belgians responded by supporting the secessionist movement in the Katanga region, in east of the country where most of the country's resources lie. Lumumba, mistakenly in hindsight, called for a UN mission, peacekeeping mission, to defend his elected government. Contrary to the stipulation of the UN mission, it was captured by people who were antagonistic to Lumumba, particularly Washington and the head of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld. Canada provided 1,900 troops, particularly in the high command of the UN mission. Canadian troops were initially rejected by the Congolese because Canada was a member of NATO alongside Belgium, and it was seen as partisan in the conflict. But ultimately, Ottawa pressed the Congolese, and Canadian troops were accepted. The UN troops really worked to undermine Lumumba, contrary to what the UN mandate was. So when Lumumba was deposed by the president in an illegal move, the UN blocked Lumumba from being able to get to the radio to rally his forces. When Lumumba tried to get his troops from the rest of the country into the capital, the UN, which was running the airports, controlling the airport, blocked his troops from getting in. Similarly, when Lumumba turned to the Eastern Bloc for weapons after Washington refused his requests, the UN blocked those weapons from coming into the capital. And ultimately, the UN handed Lumumba over to CIA and Belgian operatives who would assassinate him. And to give a sense of Ottawa's thinking about the mission in the Congo, an internal external affairs memo explains, quote, "An independent Katanga, working with the neighboring British colonies, could serve as a bulwark against the major threat to Western interests that the Lumumba government was becoming." So that gives you a sense of how Ottawa was thinking about perceiving the situation in the Congo. Numerous internal memos describe meetings between Canadian officials, external affairs officials, and the Belgian ambassador in Ottawa, and how Canada was working to support Belgian interests in the Congo. And the main beneficiary of Lumumba's assassination was foreign mining companies and Western geopolitical interests. The main Congolese beneficiary was Joseph Mobutu. People familiar with Joseph Mobutu? Some people? Not many? Well, he was, for older people, he was dictator for more than 30 years. He looted billions of dollars from the country. And he was the main beneficiary of Lumumba's assassination. And in May of 1964, he actually came to Ottawa and thanked the Canadian government for its role in the UN mission that killed Patrice Lumumba. So this top 10 list, I sent this top 10 list as a press release to a number of media outlets. And one of them, I sent it to Embassy Magazine, and a journalist at Embassy Magazine. Embassy Magazine is sort of the foreign policy establishment's journal in Ottawa. One of the journalists responded asking me about number one. So I laid out the case briefly against Pearson. And he responded by saying, "Yves, I know you're a radical, but have some pride in Canada." And that's the reaction of a professional journalist to laying the case out against a Canadian politician. Really the sort of figurehead of this sort of benevolent Canadian peacekeeping. Pearson, you know, supposedly the father of peacekeeping, Nobel Peace Prize winner, alongside that great man, Henry Kissinger. Really, to have this professional journalist reaction, basically to have a tantrum, to attack me for bad-mouthing great Canadians like Mike Pearson. I think that is sort of indicative of how much Pearson represents this sort of mythology of Canada as a force for good. And what Chomsky is referring to specifically here is Canada's role with Pearson as Prime Minister, Vietnamese, with US bombing threats. So Canadian International Control Commissioner, the UN's ICC, was designed to bring peace to Vietnam. Canada represented the Western Bloc, Poland, the Eastern Bloc, India, the Independent. Going back to the early 50s, designed to bring peace to Vietnam. Canadian ICC Commissioner would regularly go from Washington or from Ottawa down to Washington, where he would be briefed about what to tell the North Vietnamese. He would then go to Hanoi, where he would tell the North Vietnamese leadership that if they didn't do this, we, being Washington, the US, will bomb you. Of course, US bombing of North Vietnam was a war crime, and Canada's participation in this process in delivering these bombing threats is seen as supporting this aggression, US aggression, which is the ultimate crime according to the Nuremberg tribunals. Canadian ICC Commissioner would also spy on North Vietnam for the Americans. But Pearson himself was actually, rather than being this pacifist that we sort of presented as today, was a serious believer in Western imperialism, particularly in Vietnam. Going back to before the American involvement, when the French were fighting the liberation movement in Vietnam, the Canadian government was providing significant, over $100 million in aid weapons to the French, which was designed to defend Western Europe against communist aggression. The French, of course, were using those weapons in Vietnam. Prime Minister Saint-Laurent became nervous or uncomfortable about Canadian weapons being used in Vietnam. But Pearson took a hard-line position within the cabinet in support of Canadian weapons sales to the French to be used in Vietnam. And the Canadian, and I guess sort of some of this mythology about Pearson, probably the most cited example of a Canadian politician opposing US imperialism is a speech that Pearson gave at Temple University in 1965. People heard of it? Where Lyndon Johnson sort of wrapped him on the carpet afterward. Anyways, in the Canadian foreign policy literature, it's the most cited example of a Canadian politician opposing US imperialism. But what Pearson was actually doing was calling for a short-term cessation of US bombing of North Vietnam. He had a tactical difference with the way the American government was fighting the war. He didn't oppose US imperialism. Him, alongside many people within the US government, at that moment had a tactical difference with the way the US was fighting the war. And I think the rest of the speech, or another part of the speech, shows how that's the case. This is Pearson speaking, quote, "The situation cannot be expected to improve until North Vietnam becomes convinced that aggression, in whatever guise, for whatever reason, is inadmissible and will not succeed." That is supposed to be coming from the preeminent speech of a Canadian politician opposing US aggression. That's a clear speech in support of the broad parameters of US imperialism in Vietnam. And the Canadian government provided significant other support to the US war in Vietnam. Canadian weapons, huge amounts of Canadian weapons were sold to the Americans, used in Vietnam. As I mentioned earlier, Canadian aid went to supporting the US counterinsurgency effort in South Vietnam. The US tested Agent Orange, Agent Green, and Agent Blue, I believe, in New Brunswick at CFB Gagetown. And according to internal US government documents, they chose to test it in these chemical weapons in New Brunswick because the foliage was seen as similar to that in Vietnam. 20 to 30,000 Canadians fought in Vietnam, joined US units fighting in Vietnam. So during the Spanish Civil War, the Canadian government blocked or implemented something called the Foreign Enlistment Act, which was designed to block Canadians in 1936 from going over to Spain to support Spain's elected government, which was under attack from Franco's fascists, supported with significant amount of troops and weapons from Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy. These Canadians went to go volunteer against the rising tide of fascism in Europe, and the Canadian government brought in a law to block them from fighting. That law, which is still on the books today, and was on the books in the 1960s, of course the Canadian government didn't implement the Foreign Enlistment Act to block Canadians from fighting on behalf of US imperialism in Vietnam. So from what I can tell, Canadian foreign policy is motivated by two things above all else. Support for empire, historically the British Empire, today the American Empire, and not support for empire because Washington forces Ottawa into it, but because the Canadian foreign policy establishment, the Canadian elite, see the world in a very similar way to the US elite, and see their power and profits improving or increasing with US-led imperialism. The second motivation of Canadian foreign policy, which I don't think that we discuss enough, particularly the left nationalist perspective, is the support for Canadian foreign investment abroad. Canadian companies have dominated the Caribbean for the last 100 years. Canadian banks, should I say. Canadian companies more generally as well. Mining companies, Canadian mining companies with as many as 8,000 concessions around the world, dominate the mining sector in almost every country in the world, involved in horrible, terribly destructive projects. Basically, you name a country, and I can find an example. SNC-Lavalin, the world's biggest engineering company, one of the world's biggest disaster capitalist corporations. If it were based in 6 hours south in Boston, instead of being based in Montreal, there would probably be a half a dozen books about all the horrible things that SNC-Lavalin is doing around the world. SNC-Lavalin has 430 projects in 37 different African countries, to give you a sense of the scope, the international scope of this company. So Canadian foreign policy is designed to advance Canadian corporate investments, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of Canadian investment abroad. On a day-to-day basis, the Canadian High Commissions, the trade offices, the embassies around the world are largely focused on helping Canadian investors, companies, profit. The big issues are mostly, I think, motivated by the geopolitical empire-building project, Afghanistan, Haiti. But on a day-to-day basis, I think most of Canadian foreign policy is motivated by support for foreign investment. Of course, racism does motivate Canadian foreign policy. I think the case of Haiti is an example where there's a significant dose of racism involved in what's going on there, or Canada's role there. But mostly Canadian foreign policy is motivated by support for empire, support for Canadian corporate interests. And to sum up a little bit more about the motivation of the book, or what's the aim of the book now that it exists, and I'm participating in this tour. I think really the goal of the book, or major goal of the book, is to build critical consciousness in this country about what Canada does in the world. I do want to provide a voice to many of the people struggling against Canadian foreign policy today, be it in Haiti, many indigenous communities throughout Latin America struggling against the Canadian mining company. But mostly what this book is about us here in Canada developing a certain critical consciousness of Canadian foreign policy, and that instead of assuming the best of Canadian politicians when they tell us that they're trying to help the poor, they're trying to help the environment, they're working to advance women's rights, we assume the worst. We assume that they're motivated by profit and empire building. because, quite frankly, that is the history of Canadian foreign policy. So I think we need to start assuming the worst and to assume that they're lying to us, that the politicians are lying to us. It should not be a major revelation that politicians lie, but I think all too often on foreign policy, we have this perception that someone like Paul Martin, for instance, while he's working on behalf of the big business in Canada, when he goes abroad, all of a sudden he's trying to help that poor little Haitian girl that he has sitting on his lap with a Canadian flag. No, he's more so abroad, he's advancing the elite's interests. In Canada, there's we at least have an eye on the politicians. We have movements in this country that are focused on our rights here in this country. And actually it's abroad where they can get away with a lot more, where the lies can be that much bigger, because we don't have personal experience with what's taking place in Haiti. We don't have personal experience with what's going on in Afghanistan, etc. And where the Canadian politicians can get away with these lies, they do so. And so we need to start building this critical consciousness. Additionally, we need to start taking Canadian foreign policy seriously. The consequences, the effects of this country's actions abroad are significant. This is a G7 country. Yes, it's not as powerful as the US. Nevertheless, Canada is a significant player in the world, and the effects of its actions are significant. And us as Canadians living within Canada, it's our responsibility to take ownership over what our country's doing in the world and try to influence that in a positive direction. And that gets to the idea of democratizing Canadian foreign policy. Foreign policy is defined overwhelmingly by the foreign policy establishment, the banks, the mining companies, the generals, the military contractors, a handful of politicians who work to advance their own interests, not the interests of the majority of Canadians, and certainly not the interests of the majority of the world's population. So we need to start democratizing, or working to democratize Canadian foreign policy, all within the perspective of building a more just world. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
You mentioned CEDA and their projects. CEDA and Foreign Affairs have usually been working together, but have been two separate departments. Now with this new sort of redrafting of CEDA's mandate and refocusing its mandate on a few regions, it seems like they're going to be working closer with Foreign Affairs. What kind of effect is it going to make on Canada's foreign policy in general? Is it going to make any significant changes?
Well, I think that the first thing is that CEDA, in the term they use in the foreign policy literature, is that CEDA is a policy taker, not a policy maker, which is another way of saying that foreign affairs tells CEDA what to do and CEDA doesn't. That's a slight exaggeration, but that's essentially the idea that there's a distinction between foreign affairs and CEDA is a sort of a load of crap, and it's a load of crap that NGOs that are getting funded by CEDA, so-called NGOs, non-government organizations, like to sort of play up. They like to say that, yeah, Canada's militarily involved in Afghanistan, but Canada's aid in Afghanistan is somehow distinct from that military occupation. No, Canadian aid is going to Afghanistan today entirely to support the occupation. That is not to say that there's some Canadian aid in Afghanistan that is helping people, helping women, helping poor people, helping children, whatever. But the aim of that aid is to support the occupation, which I think is about supporting U.S. geopolitical interests, some companies, pipeline politics, etc. So yeah, I mean, I think there's degrees to which CEDA is subordinate to foreign affairs, and I think there is a push to make CEDA more subordinate to foreign affairs, and I think that's broadly a bad thing. But I think it's significantly exaggerated how much change is taking place. And just to give you like a little sense about the CEDA, I've mentioned this a few places, but it really strikes me at how rarely you hear this. And the Canadian government, some people may know, it was announced about 6 weeks ago or something like that, is redirecting a bunch of aid money from Africa to Latin America. And of course, if you look at poverty indicators, the situation is much worse in these African countries that are being dropped as primary recipients of Canadian aid versus these Latin American countries which are relatively wealthy comparatively. And a few critics of this have pointed out that Canadian aid is going to support Canadian mining companies, investors in these countries. Colombia, Peru has been cited. But I think that's, there's an element of that, but that's mistaking what's actually taking place. What's taking place in Latin America, there is a growing movement rejecting U.S. imperialism, working to unite to further a sort of decolonization process, if you will. And what the history of Canadian aid, going way back to 1950 with the Colombo Plan, is what Canadian aid is about, above all else, is about blunting independence. And so the shifting of Canadian aid to Latin America is designed to support those regimes, the right-wing governments, Colombia, Peru, that are most amenable to Washington and U.S. and Ottawa by extension, and to work with groups within those countries, Bolivia, for example, work with opposition groups within those countries fighting against the change taking place in Bolivia and other countries in the hemisphere. So I think the aim of Canadian aid is not, the second aim of Canadian aid is to advance Canadian corporate interests. The primary aim is to basically make the world safe for Canadian U.S. capitalism. So it's about geopolitical interests, and I think the case of Latin America is very interesting on that front, and it would be it'd be really worthwhile people into actually looking into some more of the specifics of where that Canadian aid is going to. But I can basically guarantee you it's going to, in the case of Colombia and Peru, it's clear going to the most right-wing regimes in Latin America, in South America, and in the case of some of the other countries, going to oppositional groups working to stop the social transformation taking place in those countries. That was a bit of a roundabout answer, but I got that in there. I wanted to get that in there.
Yves, yeah, again, great presentation, thanks. And I just was curious, I've got a bunch of questions for you later, but maybe you can answer this one. Because you mentioned the left, like sort of, you mentioned sort of like how left nationalists sort of maybe portray this, and I was wondering if you have any details or insight about, because we were having like some discussion with like Council of Canadians type folks, about stuff that Canada does around the world. And I was wondering if you have any kind of particular insights in the way that maybe you think that maybe left nationalism maybe curtails this discussion or this debate in a certain way. So, or if it does, right? Or I'm not sure. Yeah, but it seems like sometimes there, people I talk to who are voting in E or whatever are kind of open to saying, yeah, but it usually like this all happens. But they tend to sort of say, well, we have to kind of go in there to stop, Canada from going along with the U.S. and that's why, why we exist. But then it seems like sometimes there's like a curtailment of awareness or whatever. So
yeah, I mean, I think I have a certain sympathy for left nationalist perspective, but I think ultimately it's bankrupt. And like take Linda McQuaig. People familiar with Linda McQuaig? Yeah. She's a quite well-known columnist. She has a column in the Toronto Star. She published a book about 2 years ago called "Holding the Bully's Coat," which was maybe until my book, the first ever supposedly left-wing critique of Canadian foreign policy. In that book, I actually didn't mention it when talking about Pearson. In that book, she cites that Pearson speech at Temple University as this great example of Canadian politicians standing up to American imperialism. And as I mentioned, it's a total fraud. But she consciously mythologizes the history of Canadian foreign policy, particularly of Lester Pearson. At the same time, telling a certain level of the truth. So I don't want to completely write it off, and I do like a lot of stuff she does in domestic policy. But there is, a combination of laziness and a desire to pull at heartstrings of this mythology that the problem is the Harper government's support for Israel. The Harper government's just become supportive of Israel today, and this is we're going to go back to the time when Canada was an honest broker. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. I mean, like there's a time when Canada was a little bit better, sure, or better put, a little bit less bad, right? But it doesn't exist. It just doesn't. we can wish it were the case, you know, and as this might come across as kind of out there to some people, but as bad as things are today, you can make a case that they're better than they've ever been, certainly in terms of consciousness. So anyways, yeah, no, I think that in many cases, the left nationalists, there's a desire to, you know, like Linda McGreg's book, for instance, she doesn't talk about Canadian foreign investment whatsoever, right? Because the whole analysis is that the Americans control our economy, and that forces us to do bad things around the world, right? That we're dependent on, well, yeah, there's no doubt lots of American corporations are invested in Canada. There's also lots of Canadian corporations invested in the US, right? And Canada is actually a net exporter of foreign investment. But they're caught in this kind of like, we're basically, you know, we're forced, you know, we're sort of bullied into doing bad things. No, Peter Monk of Barrick Gold is not pillaging Papua New Guinea, Tanzania, Chile, Argentina, the list goes on because the Americans force him to. He's doing it because he makes money from it. I mean, come on, it's not, right? And Canadian aid is going to support that process. Canadian diplomacy is going to support that process. So I think that, like, yeah, I counsel Canadians. I don't want to be critical of. I'll be critical of certain elements of the Council of Canadians, and Stephen Staples, who wrote their report on foreign policy. Their sort of summary of their position on foreign policy in late 2005. And in the report, Stephen Staples is now the head of the Rideau Institute, which is the main left, the only really left foreign policy think tank in Ottawa. And in that report for the Council of Canadians, he cites the case of Haiti as an example where we should get out of Afghanistan and get our troops into Haiti. And he does that at the time, the worst political repression taking place in Haiti. And I confronted Staples on that. And I said, Stephen, you should look at what Canada's doing in Haiti, or you should start talking about what Canada's doing in Haiti. And so, I really don't know anything about Haiti. I was like, well, why did you cite it as an example where we should intervene? While we were intervening, killing people. Anyway, but that's the sort of the leadership of Council of Canadians, which I think is more wedded to this. My personal experience with chapters of Council of Canadians, they've organized a number of events across the country's Council of Canadians chapters, and I think there is a willingness among the grassroots, among the organizers in different cities to hear this message. They're not, all they get is about left nationalists. There isn't a more, what we could call, anti-imperialist or internationalist element is not coming in, right? No, we have a lot more in common with the Americans that are not benefiting from U.S. imperialism in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have a lot more in common with common Americans than we do with the Canadian elite. This sort of, we're going to build a Canadian nationalism again. No, let's build some internationalism against imperialism in general, capitalism. Lots of other things. But well said. So,
yeah.
Back.
Try to understand how the international political debate is given in Canada, how it's understood. And I can see two things. Like, one is strong solidarity movement, grassroots movement. I see solidarity movement with Colombia, with Peru, you see with Palestine, with many, many different causes around the world. But at the same time, all these decisions are taking in the government, somewhere hidden. What's going on with the SPSS? All the debate is somewhere. We have no idea what's going on. Everything is somewhere around and the decisions are taking anyway. So how do you understand this connection or disconnection or this relation? However, that phase of the solidarity movement is taken outside and is used by the government, right? Saying, yeah, we want to peace. So I don't know, how do you understand this relation or lack of relation?
I'm not sure if I fully understood the question, but basically I think the problem is the solidarity movements are way too marginal. We're way too at the margins, and foreign policy, more so than basically all domestic policy, is basically in the hands of a small elite who do it behind, they're doing it behind our backs in sort of, small groups, and and the discussion is not being had anything close to in a democratic way where there's sort of mass participation. I don't know if is that kind of what you get at, or is there something more specific that? Yeah, I think we're also too atomized, right? We see distinctions between Canadian policy in Colombia and Canadian policy towards Gaza, you know. And I think that like part of the aim of this book, for me, is to say that we're commonly working against that foreign policy establishment, right? And that foreign policy establishment, again, is motivated by two things: not justice. Not environmental concern, not women's rights, not anti-racism, whatever. It's motivated by empire and profit making, and we need to be working together, all the different solidarity movements, towards the specific issues we're working on, but also at the same time building that critical consciousness, building that thing that can exist past the specific. So it doesn't do it might help in a very short term to say the Harper government is pro-Israelism, if that's a term, is out of control, and that we should revert back to more honest broker status. That might work in a very sort of narrow kind of debate where you're sort of trying to convince some people who have been on the fence about, oh, okay, the history, yeah, he's got us too far from our real history of, good, whatever. But ultimately that reinforces the mythology, right? And too often critics of Canadian foreign policy do that, where they say this is an example of things gone bad.
Policy, but we're not talking about how the corporations are working within Canada, and when the uranium mine within Canada has its existence because they sell uranium all over the world, you basically have to target the mine within Canada, and you have to target inner politics or inner corporations within Canada. And I can't see Canadian people doing that because they all think they depend on it. And the wealth of Canada, or Alberta, for example, depends on Shell, on all the big oil corporations which are working all over the world. So we have to make the connection between foreign policy and inner corporations.
For sure, I completely agree with you. A couple things I'd add is I think you'd be surprised at the percentage of Canadians who think that corporations have too much power. I think you're talking about 80% of the population who think that corporations have too much power. So I wouldn't be so blanket about how people are unwilling to be critical. I think people are not organized. People are not motivated. People are not ready to do what needs to be done to confront corporate power. But it doesn't. I think there is a willingness or an interest or a skepticism about corporate power. And in the case of most of Canadian foreign policy, I think the aim of this book is to have it confronted here. People in Guatemala are confronting Canadian corporate power, and they can do so to a certain extent, and they've done some very heroic things. But when they have this multinational corporation with Canadian diplomacy supporting its efforts, and oftentimes the Guatemalan state, there's only so much a sort of poor, relatively disempowered indigenous community can do in terms of resisting that incursion into their lives. So that means we here need to start taking those corporations on, and it can be in all kinds of different ways. It can be something happens abroad that we shut their office down, we blockade it, we try to get the media out, we try to do whatever. It can be passing some reforms like one that exists right now about allowing Canadian corporations to be sued for what they do abroad here in Canada. That's a mild reform that's actually on the third stage of a private members bill. Is actually a Liberal MP who brought it forward. So that's the kind of thing that right now we can do put pressure on our local MPs to vote in favor. But yeah, I agree with you. It's largely about, you know, confronting things here. In the case of uranium, yeah, it's about changing the policy towards uranium extraction here in Canada.
You were talking about Canada's military role with support and interventions, and you also talking about like giving airspace and space for American fleets. Like I've heard that Canada has secret military sites where I don't know, they have a whole bunch of like military like testing or whatever. I was wondering if in your investigation you came across any of that secret military sites with the U.S.
No, I mean, I think that there's no doubt you know, in Afghanistan there's certainly like so-called forward operating bases that are, you know, some version of that. I know the Canadian government has a base in, is it Djibouti? Is it one of the small Gulf states where Canadian troops often go en route to Afghanistan to Canada? I don't know how significant the base is, and I've seen it alluded to on a couple of occasions, just very short little sort of paragraphs within larger articles. You know, obviously the problem with secret bases is that they're secret. But no, I wouldn't in any way. You know, I would assume it's, if the question is a scale, I would assume that exists. It's just a question of scale. And it, you know, it gets to stuff about, like, to give a plug to dominionpaper.ca, it comes down, and other independent media, it comes down to people investigating this stuff, right? And it's not, you know, the Edmonton Journal doesn't have you know, very big interest in uncovering this stuff, so it's a matter of independent investigative journalism. And for us, supporting things like Dominion Paper, Canadian Dimension, New Socialist, Rabble.ca, Briar Patch, and others, to, you know, do more of this kind of investigative type stuff. There was another question.
Yeah, a couple things. First, I mean, I really appreciate the points you're making, because especially, you know, we're probably looking at Ignatieff as our next prime minister, who's absolutely thoroughly steeped in Pearson Cold War ideology and that whole role. You know, his father was part of that administration, and he's just thoroughly steeped in it. So that whole question of the liberal illusions, I think, is very important. Just one thing I just sort of wanted to raise for people to think about, and you may want to comment on it, is why are Canadians so convinced, or why does our political and economic elite spend so much time convincing us that Canada has this role in the world? And I mean, I think there's two aspects to it that, at least, that are important. One being that that's what Canadians want and don't have, and so that's an important question for us. But the other is that it permits Canada to play a particular role in the world. Like right here in Edmonton, we have a whole establishment at the university which calls itself For Peace, you know, which is thoroughly steeped in responsibility to protect, and its whole mission really is to oppose people's right to self-determination, their right to be, the rights of countries to their independence and to their own role of social development. And it sits as part of the peace community. And there's huge illusions on these things. So I think that's very important. See, the other question that I just wanted to raise is, I think, is a bit of a straw man, this question of nationalism, the way it came up, because the financial oligarchy in Canada is thoroughly annexationist. You know, following 9/11, the Canadian Council of Chief Executives said economic integration is now irreversible. To them, 9/11 was a fantastic thing because it was the opportunity for irreversible economic integration. So I don't think we can talk about Canadian corporations, like that the role of the Canadian government is just to protect Canadian corporations, because first of all, they're so thoroughly integrated now. I mean, we don't have a single steel producer in Canada which is Canadian anymore. most of the mining companies are now foreign owned. Their role is still the same, right? So they're so thoroughly annexationist that really the issue is, are we going to have an independent, self-reliant economy, which means smashing the power of the monopolies, or are the monopolies going to dictate? And so it doesn't come up as nationalist versus internationalist. It comes up as a question of who is going to determine what kind of economy we want to have, and are we going to smash that monopoly dictate is the necessity.
Well, just the first comment on the second part of the question, or second part of the comment. Canadian diplomacy does go to advance particular Canadian corporate interests, and that can be defined sometimes in the case of like Ivanhoe mines, which is involved in Burma and Mongolia.
No, okay. I'm not arguing that that's not the case.
No. Yeah. Anyway, so there is like the diplomacy goes consciously towards what it defined as Canadian corporations. So I agree with you in large part on how the economic relationship, but I think that there is still such thing as sort of nationalism when it comes to corporate investment abroad, or how that plays out. But in terms of the second or the first part of the stuff about Ignatieff, I think that a major reason why they lie to us and they tell us this mythology is because they know that if Canadians knew, it would be hard to do it. Right? If most Canadians knew that Canada was actually involved in overthrowing an elected government in Haiti and supporting a terrible dictatorship, it would be much more difficult for them to do it. So the lies serve a very clear function in terms of the mythology. I think more broadly serves the function of being able to sort of give politicians more space to do what they want, and that we assume the best rather than assuming the worst. One other thing about Ignatieff, and I think that ties into all this stuff, is that the mythology, a big part of the mythology of Canada and the world, is really the brilliance of someone like Lester Pearson, and I think the brilliance of someone like Michael Ignatieff today. Lester Pearson, and in UN peacekeeping, was able to put a high-minded sounding justification for defending Washington's geopolitical interests. Today, Michael Ignatieff has a high-minded sounding responsibility to protect, which is also about defending Western imperialism. The case of Haiti is very clear that that's what the aim is. So it's a brilliance of that sort of marketing strategy and taking on a function of empire that is sort of the most nice sounding. I think the stuff about the peace movement, or the peace institutes here that are very much tied into that process, I think is I don't know much about it specifics here, but that seems very interesting. And yeah, so someone like Michael Ignatieff, we definitely need to be paying very close attention to his likely role as the next prime minister, and how his main function is foreign policy. Of course, that's the main thing he's interested in. And I think it's going to be more, it's not going to be as hard-edged imperialism as the Harper government, which just, more money to military, let's just go, defend our interests. It's going to be a bit more sort of high-minded sounding, but I think the thrust of what's going to be taking place, unless we build something sufficient to oppose that, is going to be defending Western imperialism.